What if the past isn't a place we visit, but a story we inherit, told so often it hardens into fact? Imagine a museum corridor at closing time. The lights dim, the last footsteps fade. Behind glass, objects wait in silence, each one carrying a label that claims certainty. But labels are written by people, and people, well-meaning or ambitious, fearful or proud, have always edited the world to make it easier to hold. History feels solid because we build our lives on it. We name holidays after it. We teach it to children with tidy beginnings and satisfying endings. We repeat it at dinner tables, in classrooms, on documentaries playing softly in the background. And over time, repetition becomes a kind of proof. But sometimes the proof is missing. Sometimes a famous quote was never spoken. A terrifying device was never used. A discovery was really an arrival to a place already full of lives. Sometimes an image from a painting, a costume from a stage, or a translation gone sideways becomes more powerful than any archive. These aren't just errors. They're invitations into the strange space where human memory meets human desire. Because the myths that survive usually do something useful. They flatter our progress. They simplify our guilt. They give us villains we can recognize and heroes we can celebrate. They turn complicated centuries into a single sentence you can remember on a test. Tonight, we're walking through 10 stories that were taught as truth for generations, then slowly, quietly, came undone. Not to sneer at the past, but to understand ourselves. Why do certain lies feel comforting? Why do some corrections never catch up? And what does it cost a society when its most familiar stories aren't quite real? If you listen closely, history doesn't only tell you what happened, it tells you what we needed to believe. What if the most famous symbol of medieval cruelty was built by people who lived long after the Middle Ages were over? Picture a dim exhibition room, the kind where the air smells faintly of varnish and old stone. A guide pauses beside a tall, coffin-like cabinet of iron. It's shaped almost like a human silhouette. Narrow shoulders, swelling hips, a suggestion of a face. The doors are shut, as if the object is trying to keep its own secret. Then the doors open. Spikes, dozens of them. The scene practically narrates itself. You don't need much imagination to feel your skin tighten. This, the guide says, is the Iron Maiden, an instrument designed to keep a victim alive while pain did the talking. A perfect prop for the story we've been told about the so-called Dark Ages. But the trouble with perfect props is that they tend to arrive when the story needs them. Centuries after knights and monasteries, long after the era it supposedly represents, an Iron Maiden appears in an exhibition, assembled, presented, and admired with a kind of horrified delight. Soon, copies multiply. Museums display them. Catalogues describe them. Tourists carry the image home like a souvenir of history's brutality. And yet, when historians go looking for the medieval paper trail, court records, inventories, drawings, church condemnations, anything, they find a silence that doesn't feel like absence. It feels like a missing invention, an object with no childhood. Real medieval punishment could be cruel, yes, but it was also bureaucratic. It left receipts. The Iron Maiden didn't. So why did it spread? Because it made the past simple. One object, one lesson. We are enlightened now. They were monsters then. The lie flatters the present. And maybe that's the first clue in our journey. Sometimes we don't believe a story because it's true. We believe it because it makes us feel safely superior. What if the line we repeat to prove stubbornness, the earth is flat, was never the belief of the people we accuse? On a cold morning, a schoolchild traces a map with a finger. At the edge of the paper, the ocean ends in white space. The child imagines ships tipping into a void. In the story, the Middle Ages are a foggy room. Superstitious crowds, frightened by horizons, waiting for someone brave enough to insist the world is round. It's a satisfying scene. It makes modernity feel like a rescue. But the scene doesn't match the records. For educated people in medieval Europe, astronomers, theologians, navigators, the Earth's roundness wasn't a radical new idea. It was inherited knowledge, discussed in texts, taught in universities, woven into the math of calendars and the geometry of shadows. The horizon wasn't a cliff, it was a curve. The debate wasn't flat versus round. It was size, distance, and what lay beyond the known seas. So where did the flat Earth Middle Ages come from? Not from the Middle Ages. It grows later, in an age that wanted a villain for its own self-portrait. A modern myth, painted backward, casting earlier centuries as childish, so newer centuries could look brave and rational. In this version of the past, progress isn't slow and complicated. It's a single light switch, and then the myth becomes a classroom shortcut. It fits in a paragraph. It gives a hero to cheer for and a crowd to pity. It turns history into a moral. But when history becomes a moral, it stops being a mirror, because the real lesson isn't that medieval people were foolish and we are wise. The real lesson is that every age invents an ignorant past to justify its confidence until another age comes along and does the same to us. So here's the question that lingers. If we can be wrong about what they believed, what else have we been using as a convenient contrast? And what would it feel like to meet the past as human, not as a prop? What if a single word, translated the wrong way, could change how an entire world imagines an ancient people? Close your eyes and picture the pyramids under a white sun. Not the tourist postcard version, the quiet version. Wind moving over sand, stone holding heat. Somewhere inside those chambers, names are carved in a script that looks like art. And for centuries, the people who built this world were described with one sweeping explanation. They were obsessed with death. It's a familiar idea. Egypt as a civilization of tombs, a culture fixated on the afterlife, a nation that poured its genius into preparing for the grave. But what if the story is tilted because a modern language leaned too hard on a single label? When early scholars began decoding Egyptian writing, they reached for the closest word they had. They called the inscriptions hieroglyphs, a term that suggests something sacred and mysterious. They translated certain ideas with the gravity of their own worldviews, religious, romantic, Victorian. And in that translation, a living society can begin to look like a funeral. Yet the more you listen to what remains, letters, records, work logs, jokes scratched by laborers, prayers for bread, complaints about co-workers, the more the old story phrase. There is death, yes, but there is also life everywhere. Contracts, medicine, love poems, beer rations, childhood, music, bureaucratic squabbles, and the ordinary hope that tomorrow will be better than today. The tomb is not the whole civilization. It is one room in a vast house. The pyramids themselves, so often framed as monuments to a morbid obsession, can also be read as something more complicated: a state project, an economy, a public performance of stability, a promise that the world has order, not just a bridge to an afterlife, but a message to the living. The river will return, the sun will rise, the kingdom will endure. So the lie isn't that ancient Egyptians cared about death. The lie is that they cared about nothing else. And that lie reveals something about us. We tend to reduce unfamiliar cultures into a single theme that feels poetic or exotic. We flatten the complexity so we can hold it in one hand. If our translations can shrink a civilization into a cliché, what else do we misunderstand? Not because we lack facts, but because we crave a simple story. What if the most quoted last words in history were never said at all, only written later, when the world needed a cleaner ending? A man is led to a scaffold. The crowd holds its breath. Someone in the distance prays. Someone closer wants a story to tell afterward. The moment is a doorway, one life ending, a nation shifting, history leaning forward. And then, as the blade rises, the legend hands him a final sentence, sharp, elegant, unforgettable. Let them eat cake. Et tu, brute? I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. These lines move like arrows. They hit the listener instantly. They make the past feel intimate, as if we were standing there. They give history a sense of script writing, setup, climax, perfect final note. But real last moments are messy. They are interrupted. They are misunderstood. They are rarely recorded with the clarity we later demand. In many famous cases, the quote appears years afterward, in the hands of memoirists, political enemies, admirers, or playwrights. The quote functions less like a transcript and more like a verdict. It tells us what we are supposed to believe about the person's character: cruel, noble, betraying, betrayed. And once a quote becomes a symbol, it stops being questioned. It's too useful. Because societies love a clean ending. We love a single sentence that sums up a revolution, a betrayal, a martyrdom. We want the emotional math to come out evenly. The hero says something heroic. The villain says something chilling. The tragedy lands with poetic symmetry. But the true past is not obligated to satisfy our taste. Sometimes the last thing someone says is ordinary. Sometimes it's private. Sometimes it's lost entirely, swallowed by noise, fear, and the simple fact that history isn't always listening. So why do we keep the invented lines? Because they do what facts often can't. They compress a complicated life into a moral we can memorize. They make chaos feel meaningful. And here's the uneasy thought. If we accept a made-up sentence to make a story satisfying, what else are we willing to accept, so long as it feels right? When does meaning become a substitute for truth? What if one of the most enduring ancient symbols of purity was actually a modern costume stitched from nostalgia? The scene is always the same: a field of white, sunlight on linen, a woman walking toward a temple with calm certainty. Her clothing is simple, spotless, almost glowing. In our minds, that whiteness means something. It says virtue. It says clarity. It says the past was cleaner than we are. But cloth doesn't carry morals. People give it meaning. In the ancient world, dyes were everywhere. Rich reds, deep blues, saffron yellows, patterns that signaled wealth, status, region, and pride. White cloth existed, of course, but it stained easily and required labor to keep bright. Often, white wasn't even the goal. It was simply undyed fabric, worn because it was practical, not because it was pure. So how did we end up imagining the ancients as a civilization of radiant white? Partly through sculpture and time. Statues we see today, pale and clean in museums, were often once painted in vivid color. The pigments faded, the paint chipped, and centuries of weather stripped the surface down to stone. When modern viewers encountered that whiteness, They treated it like an aesthetic truth, not an accident of survival. Then art reinforced it. Renaissance painters and later classicists fell in love with marble purity. Museums elevated white as refinement. Stage productions, films, illustrations, each one repeating the same palette until it felt inevitable. A visual lie, repeated until it became atmosphere. And like all atmosphere, it influences how we feel without us noticing. If the past looks pure, then the present looks stained. If ancient life appears simple and spotless, then our complexity seems like decay. A false image becomes a quiet moral judgment. But when researchers reconstruct the original colors, when they show the blues and reds and golds, something shifts. The past becomes less like a ghost and more like a city, less like an ideal, more like a place where people laughed, argued, showed off, and tried to be seen. The lie wasn't only about fabric or paint, it was about longing. We don't just study history, we use it as a mirror for what we wish we were. And sometimes we bleach the past to make it look like an answer. So here's the question. When we picture the way it used to be, are we remembering or are we designing a dream? What if the first famous discovery wasn't a first at all, just the version that survived long enough to be credited? Think of a shoreline at dusk. A ship appears as a dark shape on the horizon, growing slowly into detail. On board, men grip ropes and railings, smelling land before they see it. They step onto sand and believe, truly believe, they have reached the edge of the world. In the popular story, this is how new places enter history. One dramatic arrival, one name written in bold, one moment that flips the map like a page. But maps are not born in a single day. Before any celebrated explorer planted a flag, people had already lived there, named the rivers, buried their grandparents in the soil, argued about boundaries, told stories about the stars. Long before a discovery, there was home. Even beyond indigenous lives, the record of who arrived when can be tangled. Traders drifted with currents. Fishing boats got lost. Rumors traveled ahead of ships. Some voyages were recorded badly, some deliberately exaggerated, some erased because the wrong empire made them, or the wrong language wrote them down, or the right audience didn't care. History tends to crown a winner, not because the winner was first, but because the winner controlled the archive. And once a culture chooses a single hero for the story, it becomes hard to widen the frame. A complex web of contact becomes a straight line. Many voices become one signature. This isn't only about pride, it's about how the human mind handles scale. We reach for a symbol, one person, one ship, one date, because the truth is too large. The truth requires us to hold contradictions. That movement can be both wonder and violence. That curiosity can travel with greed. That arrival can be celebration for one side and rupture for another. If discovery is a word that implies emptiness before the discoverer, then it already contains a lie. A place is not real only when it is seen by someone powerful. So the more honest question isn't who discovered it. The more honest question is who gets to be remembered as the one who did. And if memory is shaped by power, what parts of today's world are being quietly edited right now by what gets recorded and what gets ignored? What if the ancient prophecy you've heard about was never ancient, only repackaged to sound inevitable? It starts the way legends love to start, with a dusty manuscript, a hidden library, a sentence that seems to reach across centuries and point directly at us, a warning, a prediction, proof that someone long ago saw the future and tried to tell us. We are drawn to prophecy because it flatters our moment. It suggests we live in the chapter that matters most. But when you follow the paper trail, the prophecy often turns out to be younger than it claims. A line appears in print decades after the event it supposedly predicted. Or a phrase is translated loosely, then tightened into certainty. Or a poem meant to be symbolic is treated like a timeline. And suddenly, a flexible metaphor becomes a hard arrow pointing forward. The process is quiet. It doesn't require a villain. It only requires a few ordinary human habits: selective memory, dramatic storytelling, and the temptation to make chaos feel scripted. Because the future is frightening when it's open. We look for patterns in smoke. We connect dots that were never meant to be connected. We take a vague sentence, "A great change will come," and attach it to whatever catastrophe or triumph is closest to our hearts. We shift words until they fit. We highlight the hits and forget the misses. And once a prophecy works, we stop checking the math. The lie becomes comfort. It suggests the universe has a plan, that history is not random, that suffering is part of a narrative arc. It gives disaster a kind of dignity. It turns uncertainty into fate. But fate can be a trap. When people believe the future is pre-written, they can become passive. Or worse, they can start trying to force the prophecy to come true, mistaking their own choices for destiny. So the revelation isn't just that the prophecy is unreliable. The revelation is that we keep making prophecies because we are uncomfortable with freedom. We want the world to be readable, like a book we've already finished. But the honest version of time is less satisfying and more human. The future is not a sentence waiting to be discovered. It's a conversation shaped by decisions, accidents, courage, and neglect. So here's the question to sit with. When we say, "It was foretold," are we hearing a voice from the past, or are we listening to our own need for certainty echoing back at us? What if a miracle cure from the past wasn't medicine at all, just hope packaged in the language of certainty? Picture a small bottle on a wooden shelf, amber glass, a paper label with ornate lettering. It promises relief from pain, weakness, sadness, sleeplessness, everything at once. The kind of promise that sounds impossible now, but once sounded like progress. In an age without antibiotics, without modern anesthesia, without reliable diagnosis, pain was a constant companion. So were mystery illnesses that came and went like weather. People wanted anything that offered control, anything that transformed fear into a plan. Enter the miracle tonic. It might contain herbs that truly soothed. It might contain alcohol. Sometimes it contained narcotics or stimulants or chemicals whose names weren't understood by the people selling them. The customer felt something: warmth, calm, energy, and mistook sensation for healing. The bottle seemed to work, at least for an evening, and that was enough for the story to spread. Advertisers learned to speak in absolutes. Testimonials became proof. A single dramatic recovery outshone 100 quiet failures. The marketing didn't need to be malicious to be effective. It only needed to match what people were desperate to hear. And then the lie became tradition. Old remedies gained authority simply by surviving. If it lasted in the family for generations, it must have truth in it. If grandma swore by it, questioning it feels like questioning love itself. But time doesn't validate medicine. Time only validates memory. When modern science finally interrogates these cures, sometimes it finds nothing beyond placebo. Sometimes it finds an active ingredient, but in unpredictable doses, mixed with dangerous compounds, delivered without safeguards. The story wasn't "they were foolish." The story was they were human, trying to survive in a world that offered little mercy. Yet the deeper tension remains. We still buy miracle bottles, just with sleeker packaging and new vocabulary. We still confuse confidence with evidence. We still want the comfort of a single solution. So the lie isn't only historical, it's a pattern. If the past teaches us anything here, it's that hope can be exploited without anyone needing to be evil, only impatient, frightened, or eager to believe. The question isn't whether people used to fall for miracle cures. The question is, what kinds of promises do we fall for now, simply because uncertainty hurts too much to hold? What if the lost library we mourn wasn't only destroyed by fire, but by the quieter flames of neglect, politics, and time? There's a certain kind of sadness that comes from imagining knowledge burning. A grand hall, shelves stacked like cliffs, scrolls and books holding centuries of thought, then chaos, smoke, shouting, the crackle of pages turning to ash. The story is irresistible because it gives the world a single villain, an invader, a fanatic, an accident, and a single moment when everything went wrong. We point to it and say, if not for that day, we might know so much more. But libraries rarely die in one night. Sometimes they scatter. Funding dries up. Patrons shift their attention. A dynasty falls, and the next regime has different priorities. Texts are copied selectively. What isn't copied fades. Languages change. Materials decay. A flood ruins a storeroom. A war interrupts trade. A scribe chooses one manuscript over another because ink is expensive and time is short. In the legend, knowledge is a treasure chest that can be stolen. In reality, knowledge is a garden that must be tended. And that is the part that hurts more. Because it means loss isn't always dramatic. It's often ordinary. It happens when nobody notices, when the world is busy, when crisis after crisis pushes preservation to the bottom of the list. The myth of a single catastrophic destruction can also let us off the hook. If the past lost its wisdom because of one terrible event, then our job is only to mourn. But if knowledge is lost through 1,000 small failures, then the mirror turns toward us. What are we failing to preserve right now? Not just books, languages, oral histories, local archives, scientific data stored on decaying formats, the memories of elders who won't be recorded in time, the quiet research that never becomes famous and is easier to defund, the fragile truth that doesn't fit a headline. The revelation in this story is not that ancient libraries were unimportant, it's that knowledge is always more vulnerable than we admit, not because enemies are always at the gate, but because attention is scarce. So here's the open question. If a civilization can lose its memory without noticing, what does it mean to be advanced? And what would it look like to treat preservation, not as nostalgia, but as a duty to the future? What if the golden age we're taught to admire was never as unified as the paintings suggest, only stitched together after the fact to make a nation feel older? Imagine a parade of images, philosophers in white robes, marble columns glowing, laws written in perfect reason. In this story, a civilization becomes a single shining statue. You can circle it, admire it, and believe it represents a clear origin of democracy, of science, of the West. It feels comforting to have a clean beginning. But real societies don't arrive as statues. They arrive as arguments. What we call a golden age is often a patchwork of competing cities, rival leaders, shifting borders, uneasy trade, and constant negotiation over who counts as us. Freedom for some, alongside exclusion for others. genius flourishing in one corner while war burns in another. The same era that produces breathtaking art can also produce brutal policies. The same public square that hosts debate can also host silence enforced by power. Later generations, hungry for roots, smooth those contradictions into a single narrative. They pick the parts that flatter their values and trim the rest away. They build monuments in language. This is where it began. This is what we inherited. This is the model. And then the model hardens. Schoolbooks compress centuries into a few heroic figures. Museums arrange artifacts as if they were inevitable steps toward modern ideals. The messy reality, conflict, compromise, ordinary labor fades into the background, like stagehands in a spotlighted play. The lie here isn't that the past produced brilliance. The lie is that brilliance was pure. When we turn an era into a golden idol, we stop seeing it as human. We stop learning from its mistakes because we've edited the mistakes out. We stop noticing how fragile progress can be, how quickly a society can slide from open debate to fear, from innovation to stagnation. And we also risk a subtler harm. We start treating other cultures as footnotes, as if history belongs to one lineage and everyone else arrived late. So the question becomes less about whether a golden age existed, and more about why we need one. What hunger does it feed in the present? What insecurity does it soothe? If the past was not a single shining statue, but a living, quarrelsome city, then perhaps the real inheritance isn't perfection. Perhaps it's the responsibility to keep arguing towards something better. What if the most dramatic, vanished civilization story wasn't a disappearance at all, just a slow blending that didn't fit a thrilling headline? At the edge of a jungle, stone steps rise out of green like bones. Vines wrap the walls. Birds call from somewhere unseen. A visitor stands there and feels the familiar chill. Lost city, swallowed by nature, a people gone without explanation. We love this image because it makes the world feel haunted. In the popular version, a mighty civilization collapses overnight, mysteriously, almost magically, leaving only ruins and questions. The disappearance becomes a riddle we can hold up to our own anxieties. What if we vanish too? But when archaeologists and historians look closely, the vanish becomes more like a transformation. Populations move, cities shrink, power shifts to new centers, drought arrives, then war, then economic strain. Families adapt, farmers change crops, leaders lose legitimacy. Some people leave, others stay, and life continues in altered forms. The ruins remain, but the people don't simply evaporate. Sometimes what disappears is not a civilization, but a way of organizing it. The empire ends, the language changes, the architecture stops being built, and later observers, arriving after the spotlight has moved, mistake that shift for extinction. It's a common mistake. We treat history like a stage. When the costumes change, we assume the actors have left. But human life is stubborn. It survives in quieter places, in villages, in intermarriage, in new religions layered over old ones, in stories told at night that never enter official records. The revelation is humbling. The past is not always lost because it ended. Sometimes it's lost because our categories can't follow it. Our imagination prefers clean borders, alive or dead, thriving or gone, triumph or collapse. Reality lives in the in-between, and that in-between has a lesson for the present. We're terrified of collapse because we picture it as a cliff, but many collapses are slopes, long, uneven, full of chances to adjust. Which means the warning isn't only about sudden catastrophe, it's about gradual drift. So here's the question that lingers among the vines. If a society can change so slowly that later generations mistake it for disappearance, what changes are happening around us right now? So gradual we barely notice. And what would it take to see them before they become ruins we only learn from afterward? What if the biggest lie history teaches isn't a specific fact, but the idea that correcting a lie is simple? A researcher sits alone with a stack of papers, the kind that smell like dust and patience. In the margins are small human marks, underlines, question marks, corrections that never made it into a textbook. Outside, the world moves fast. Headlines refresh. People argue in short sentences. And somewhere, a familiar myth keeps circulating, bright and easy, unbothered by nuance. This is the final tension behind every story we've told. Truth is slow. A lie often arrives with a strong image, a spiked coffin, a ship at the edge of a flat world, a perfect last line spoken under a blade. It fits in memory like a song chorus. It travels without friction. It feels complete. Truth, meanwhile, tends to arrive with footnotes. It arrives with probably, with, the evidence suggests, with competing interpretations that refuse to resolve into a single dramatic conclusion. It asks the listener to hold complexity. It asks for humility. And humility is not viral. Even when the correction is clear, the myth remains useful. Teachers repeat it because it's a shortcut. Tour guides repeat it because it sells. Filmmakers repeat it because it's cinematic. We repeat it because it makes conversations smoother, because it's what everyone already recognizes. And so history becomes a landscape of repeating echoes. The wrong story continues, not because people love being wrong, but because humans are built to conserve effort. We prefer what is familiar. We prefer what is emotionally satisfying. We prefer what gives us an easy villain and an easy hero. The uncomfortable revelation is that the past is not the only thing being edited. Every day, we edit the present in the same way. We turn complicated events into simple narratives. We share the version that flatters our side, our identity, our hope. We build myths in real time, then defend them because letting go would feel like losing ourselves. So what do we do with this? Not cynicism, not the smugness of everything is fake. That's just another shortcut, another easy story. The more human response is attention. To practice curiosity instead of certainty. To ask, how do we know? To accept that learning the truth may require giving up a satisfying image. To treat correction not as humiliation, but as growth. Because the point of confronting old lies isn't to scold the dead, it's to become better ancestors. If history is a conversation across time, then every myth we let go of makes room for a more honest voice to speak. We began in a museum corridor, with objects behind glass and labels that sounded certain. Now, as the lights come up, the corridor looks different, not emptier, more alive. Because each corrected myth doesn't remove meaning from the past. It returns meaning to the people who actually lived it. The Iron Maiden becomes not proof of medieval darkness, but proof of how eagerly later generations build a frightening before to praise their after. The flat earth Middle Ages dissolve into a reminder that ignorance is a story we often assign to others. The misquoted last words become a lesson in how badly we want history to speak in perfect sentences. The whitened statues regain their color, and with it, their humanity. Discovery becomes a word we handle more carefully because it can erase the lives that made a place real long before any flag arrived. Prophecies lose their certainty, and we are returned to responsibility, because an open future demands courage. Miracle cures teach us how hope can masquerade as evidence. Lost libraries teach us that preservation is not nostalgia, but stewardship. Golden ages teach us that brilliance and contradiction can coexist. Vanished civilizations teach us to look for transformation, not magic disappearance. And beneath all of it runs one quiet truth. We are not just consumers of history, we are makers of it. Every time we repeat a story, we reinforce it. Every time we question one, we widen the space for something truer to grow. That doesn't mean we must live suspicious of everything. It means we live awake. Because facts matter, yes, but so does the way we hold them, with humility, with empathy, with the awareness that our own age is building myths right now, in real time, with the same tools the past used: fear, pride, longing, and the hunger for a simple ending. So maybe the final question isn't which stories were lies. Maybe it's what kind of relationship do we want with truth? A relationship built on comfort will always drift toward myth. A relationship built on curiosity can handle complexity without breaking. It can admit, "I don't know yet," and keep going. History isn't a vault of finished answers. It's a field of signals, faint and partial, waiting for careful listeners. And if memory can be shaped, then so can the future. The past asks us softly not to be perfect, only to be honest enough to keep learning.